Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we're going to look at backups, multi-AZ and read replicas with RDS. Now it doesn't matter what exam that you're doing, whether it's Solutions Architect Associate, Developer Associate or SysOps Administrator Associate, having a clear understanding of the difference between multi-AZ and read replicas will pick you up at least 3 or 4 points on your exam. In some exams it will pick you up more, it really depends on the exam. So you need to have a clear understanding of what that is going into the exam. Before we get onto that though, let's just start with some backups. So there's two types of backups for AWS. There's automated backups and there's database snapshots. Now automated backups will allow you to recover your database to any point in time within a retention period, and the retention period can be between 1 and 35 days. Automated backups will basically take a full daily snapshot and will also store transaction logs throughout the day. And then when you recover, AWS will first choose the most recent daily backup, so choose the snapshot that's most recent, and then apply those transaction logs that are relevant to that day. And that's how we do a restore with automated backups. And this basically allows you to do a point-in-time recovery down to a second within the retention period window. So the retention period window is between 1 and 35 days. Now, the cool thing about automated backups is they're enabled by default. The backup data is stored on S3, and you're going to get free storage space equal to the size of your database. So let's say you have an RDS instance of 10 gigs, you're going to get 10 gigs worth of storage that's free on S3. And backups are taken within a defined window. During the backup window, storage I/O may be suspended while your data is being backed up, and you may experience some elevated latency. And you saw in the last lecture where we basically defined our backup window, we left everything as the default values, but when you go and create your database, you can define the backup window. You can also edit it for your existing databases. Moving on to snapshots. So snapshots are simply what you would think they are. They're basically a snapshot of the database. So just like a Polaroid takes snapshots, when we do a database snapshot, it's going to take a snapshot of the database. It's always done manually, so they're always user initiated, and they will always be stored even after you delete the original RDS instance. If you delete the original RDS instance, your automated backups will also be deleted with it as well, whereas DB snapshots basically sit as a standalone file, and you can delete the RDS instance without having to worry about those snapshots being deleted as well. So moving on to restoring backups, whenever you restore either an automatic backup or a manual snapshot, the restored version of the database will be a new RDS instance with a new DNS endpoint. So when we do a restore, let's say that this is our DNS endpoint for the original database. So we've got original.eu-west-1.rds.amazon.aws.com. When we do a restore, it's going to have a new DNS endpoint. So they are basically completely separate databases with completely separate DNS endpoints. Now, before we have a look at how we go and do this, I just want to talk a little bit about encryption. Encryption at rest is supported for MySQL, Oracle, SQL Server, PostgreSQL, MariaDB, and Aurora, so everything now supports encryption at rest. It's done using the AWS KMS or Key Management Service. We cover KMS in an awful lot of detail in this Certified Security Specialty course, so if you do want to go on and get security certified, which is really valuable right now, definitely check out that course. So once your RDS instance is encrypted, the data stored at rest in the underlying storage is encrypted, as are all of its automated backups, read replicas, and snapshots. So once you encrypt a database, anything you do with that database in terms of making a copy of that data is going to be encrypted as well. And at the present time, encrypting an existing DB instance is not supported. To use RDS encryption for an existing database, you must first create a snapshot and then make a copy of that snapshot and encrypt the copy, and we'll look at how to do that and general backups right now. Okay, so here I am in the AWS console in the RDS section, which sits under databases, and what I want to do is I want to go over to that database instance that we launched in the very last lecture. So we called it a Cloud Guru, and click in here. In here, we've got our instance actions. In here, I can create a read replica, Aurora read replica. We can take a snapshot, restore to a point in time, migrate latest snapshot, etc., etc. I'm going to explain what read replicas and multi-AZs are. I can also modify the database. If you click on modify, in here, you'll be able to scroll all the way down and change the backup retention period. So we can go from 7 days all the way down to 35 days. We can also go and change the backup window. It is in UTC time. So you can say I want it to start at 2 a.m. or 2:16 a.m. UTC and have a window for half an hour. So you can change that all in there. So let's go click on snapshots. In here we can see our automated snapshots. So these are snapshots. This was first a snap that was taken when I first created this database. If I wanted to go and do a point in time, I'd go back over to my instances, click in here, and I can go to instance actions, and I can go to restore to a point in time. Essentially what that's going to do, if I click in here and go to custom, I'll be able to do the date, the time, and it's all again in UTC, and I can go right down to the very second. As I said, what it's going to do is first restore that snapshot, and then it's going to apply all the transaction logs to that snapshot, and then it will bring it back to a point in time down to the second. So it is really, really cool. Let's have a look at one last thing before we move on to read replicas versus multi-AZ. If I click on instances, and if I click in here, I can go instance actions, and I can take a snapshot. Let's go and take a manual snapshot. I'll call it a Cloud Guru manual snap. And go ahead and hit take snapshot. That is now creating my snapshot. I'm going to pause the video and just wait for this to come up. Okay, so I'm just going to refresh the page. Hopefully that is finished being created now. And there we go, it is now available. If I click in here, what I can do is I can go to actions and I can go to copy snapshot. When I go to copy snapshot, I can actually scroll down. You can see I can enable encryption. So that's how we would turn encryption on. I'd basically create a copy, and then from that copy, that encrypted copy of the snapshot, I would then deploy a new RDS instance. So that's important to remember for your exam. Now let's learn the differences between multi-AZ and read replicas. So what is multi-AZ? Well, here we've got an elastic load balancer with some EC2 instances behind it, and they're all pointing at an RDS database. And this RDS database is in US East 1A. So these EC2 instances, if they make any writes to US 1A, so any changes to that database, what will happen is those changes will be synchronously replicated to US East 1B. And US East 1B will be an exact copy of US East 1A. Now it's important to understand that this is for disaster recovery only. So in the event that we lose US East 1A, it will automatically fail over to US East 1B. So how does that work? Well, if you remember in the last lecture, we had the connect.php file, and we had this thing called the host name. And the host name simply contained our DNS endpoint. So acloudguru.c1xwmse1kl.eu-west-1.rds.amazon.com. So that is simply a DNS address. That DNS address is actually public and publicly available. And what will happen is that if you lose your primary database, Amazon will detect that, and it will update the DNS address to point to the IP address of your multi-AZ copy of your database. So it's really important to understand that you never deal with IP addresses when dealing with RDS. You always just use this DNS endpoint, and this DNS endpoint will fail over automatically to your, your secondary multi-AZ database. So multi-AZ allows you to have an exact copy of your production database in another availability zone, and AWS handle the replication for you. So when your production database is written to, this write will automatically be synchronized to the standby database. And so in the event of database maintenance or a DB instance failure or an availability zone failure, Amazon RDS will automatically fail over to the standby so that the database operations can resume quickly without administrative intervention. So it fails over automatically. Your downtime is going to be very, very limited, probably only a minute or so. So it's really, really critical to remember that multi-AZ is for disaster recovery only. It is not primarily used for improving performance performance. If you want performance improvement, you're going to need read replicas, and it's really critical to understand that for any of the associate exams. If you want disaster recovery, you're using multi-AZ. If you want performance improvements, you're going to use read replicas. Before we go on to what a read replica is, just remember that multi-AZ databases are available for SQL Server, Oracle, MySQL, PostgreSQL, MariaDB. You could argue Aurora as well. Aurora is actually built into the entire database design. I haven't put it here as a bullet point, but it definitely has, Aurora by default is spread across multiple availability zones. So you don't need to turn on multi-AZ for Aurora, but for the other RDS instances, you can definitely turn it on. So moving on to read replicas. What is a read replica? Well, let's take our elastic load balancer with our EC2 instances, as we had in the last a few slides ago, and they're basically doing a write to an RDS database. Now, when you set up a read replica, these writes are going to be pushed out to other copies of the database, and you can have 5 read replicas per production database by default. And so why would you do this? Well, let's say that 90% of your traffic is read traffic, and you've got all these EC2 instances, and 90% of what they're doing is just doing reads from the database. This could be like a very popular WordPress blog or a popular Joomla site or something like that. To be honest, it depends on the workload, but a lot of applications, a lot of it is read. People are reading more than they're contributing on the internet, generally speaking. So you could scale this out by, instead of having those EC2 instances going to the production database, the primary database, they read from the read replicas, or you could have it so that one reads from the production and the other 2 read from read replicas, whatever. This is a way of scaling out your database so that you take the load off the primary database and you spread that load across 1 or more read replicas. You can also have read replicas of read replicas. You will get some replication latency if you do that, but you could have a read replica in another availability zone, or you could have a read replica in a read replica in a completely different region. It's completely up to you. So read replicas allow you to have a read-only copy of your production database. This is achieved using asynchronous replication for the primary RDS instance to the read replica, and you use read replicas primarily for very read-heavy database workloads. So use read replicas to scale out. Now, I did say earlier that multi-AZ is synchronous, whereas read replicas are asynchronous. You don't actually need to worry about that at any of the associate level questions. When you start doing the professional level questions, they'll try and confuse you and try and test whether you know which is synchronous and which is asynchronous, but you won't have that at the associate level. So read replica databases are currently available for MySQL Server, PostgreSQL, MariaDB, and Aurora, so it's available for 4. They are currently not available for SQL Server or for Oracle. So read replicas, they're used for scaling, not for disaster recovery. If you need to scale out, use read replicas. If you need disaster recovery, you want multi-AZ. You must have automatic backups turned on in order to deploy a read replica. You can have up to 5 read replica copies of any database, and you can have read replicas of read replicas, but watch out for latency. Each read replica is going to have its own DNS endpoint. You can have read replicas that have multi-AZ enabled. This is a very new feature that was released in January 2018. So you can have a read replica in a completely different availability zone or completely different region that has multi-AZ turned on. And you can create read replicas of multi-AZ source databases. So in other words, if you have multi-AZ turned on to your, to your RDS instance, you can still go in and create read replicas. It doesn't break it at all. And then read replicas can be promoted to become their own databases. Now this will break the replication, but this can be very, very useful if you need a copy of your database. Maybe you've got too many read replicas, you're not using enough of them, and you want to do some, some other sort of work on your databases, and you don't want to do this on your production database. You can promote your read replica to become its own database. This will break the replication, however. And then finally, you can have a read replica in another region. It doesn't have to be tied down to the region in which your production database is in. Let's go have a look at how we can enable multi-AZ and read replicas in the console. Okay, so here I am back in the AWS console. If I go down to databases and click on relational database service, this will open up the RDS splash screen. I'm going to go and grab the instance that we were using previously, so a Cloud Guru. I'm going to go in and click on it so it's selected, and then go to instance actions. Straight away I can click on create read replica. You can specify the destination here, so that it can be completely different region. You can specify the subnet groups, the availability zones, whether or not it's publicly accessible or not. You can actually enable encryption on your read replicas even if the primary database is not encrypted. You can select your instance classes here. You can make your read replica multi-AZ, and then you just basically can go and set up monitoring. You can have enhanced monitoring on it. You can have logs exported to CloudWatch logs from your read replicas as well. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel. I don't really need to create a read replica. The other way you can turn on multi-AZ is if you just go over to instance actions, go to modify. In here you can actually just specify that you want multi-AZ deployment, and the way this would typically be done is, let's say this is my test and dev database and my site is almost ready to go live, but I didn't want to have multi-AZ on test and dev. What I can do is go into my database and make it multi-AZ, and thus promoting it to become a production database. So that is read replicas and multi-AZ in a nutshell. You do definitely have to have a clear understanding of the two going into any associate exam and pretty much any professional exam. You will always get marks for knowing the difference between the two. Remember, read replicas are for scaling, they're for performance enhancement, whereas multi-AZ is for disaster recovery. You can go back now and delete this RDS instance. We're not going to be using it anymore, so just go over to your instance actions and go ahead and hit delete. I'm not going to create a final snapshot. You can if you want. If you aren't going to create a final snapshot, it says I acknowledge that upon instance deletion, all my automatic backups, including system snapshots and point-in-time recovery, will no longer be available. So it will delete all the automatic backups when you delete your RDS instance. So that is it for this lecture, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.